What's up, podcast listeners? This is a bonus episode that I posted up on the Patreon page, and after further reflection, decided to post on iTunes also for you to check out. I wanted to let you know these are the types of episodes I'll be posting on Patreon in the future, and I thought that you would enjoy it. So I hope you like it. Hello, and welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know that Benedict Arnold was so frustrated by his treatment in the Continental Army that he tried to resign multiple times, and Washington kept saying no? That when John Andre crossed the river to meet with Benedict Arnold to finalize plans for turning over West Point, Andre was stranded, leading him to be caught and hanged by the American forces. And that Benedict Arnold's wife Peggy, who likely played a critical role in helping him deceive the Americans and switch sides to the British, pretended to be crazy when she was found out, which allowed her to escape safely back into the arms of her husband, Benedict. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we'll cover that and more in Patreon bonus episode, Benedict Arnold, American Traitor. All right, everyone, welcome in to the episode. This is bonus episode, Benedict Arnold, American Traitor, and today we are going to walk you through the entire saga of Benedict Arnold deciding to become a traitor and switching sides from the American forces to the British. So I'll walk you through Benedict Arnold's personal history a little bit, and then we will dive into the background and what was going on with Arnold and why he wanted to become a traitor, how he did it, how it worked out for him, etc. It's always been a story I've been really fascinated by. And so I wanted to provide you with this episode today, basically telling you everything I know about it, and then, of course, in addition to the research I did for this episode. So Benedict Arnold was born in Connecticut in 1741, and he was born into a wealthy family in Upper Norwich society, which is Norwich, Connecticut. And disaster struck as Arnold was growing up. 4 of his 5 siblings died at a young age from yellow fever, and because of this, his father took up drinking. So Benedict and one of his sisters were the only ones that actually survived into adulthood. This likely drove Arnold to want to secure wealth on his own, prove himself to those around him, and an enormous chip on his shoulder that will seemingly never fall off. At the age of 16, he signed up for militia service, volunteer militia service during the French and Indian War, but that only lasted a couple weeks. He was in one small skirmish, and then he withdrew. By the age of 21, he had found himself involved in numerous successful business ventures and was really a hard-driving businessman. He was extremely motivated, very passionate, and very ambitious. He would travel around New England, Canada, and into the West Indies with his trade ships, usually commanding one of them, and he was not a man to be trifled with. Once, in the Caribbean, after being insulted, he shot a man, injuring him, and threatened to fire again to finish the job, when the man eventually relented and apologized to Arnold for the slight. Arnold seemed satisfied enough. The passage of the Sugar and Stamp Acts, which we've talked about in a bit of detail here in this podcast, in 1764 and 1765 respectively, did financial damage to Arnold's business ventures, prompting him to join, at least in the periphery, of the Sons of Liberty. As he fell deeper into debt, Arnold began to smuggle significant amounts of goods, basically just totally ignoring Parliament's tariffs and further cementing himself into the patriot cause. When Arnold heard about the Boston Massacre, he was in the West Indies at the time on business, he wrote that, quote, "Good God, are the Americans all asleep and tamely giving up their liberties, or are they all turned philosophers? that they don't take immediate vengeance on such miscreants. Arnold began the Revolutionary War as a captain and was quickly promoted to colonel when he proposed the idea for the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga. And this is where the narrative in this podcast really begins with Benedict Arnold, when we started talking about him and the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga. Because as you know, Arnold, along with Ethan Allen, seized Ticonderoga and also raided Fort St. Jean. In 1775, Arnold led about 1,000 men through the Maine wilderness to assault Quebec City, an absolute disaster for Arnold, in which he had his confidence, reputation, and left leg all shattered in one night. Falling back to Montreal following his disaster at Quebec, and before being pushed out by the British that summer, Arnold directed the construction of a fleet on Lake Champlain and fought valiantly in the defeat at the Battle of Valcour Island. Although it wasn't a victory, this was a critically important and brave action that slowed the British enough to prevent them from taking Ticonderoga and continuing to push into the New York interior. Throughout these experiences, Arnold was gaining a reputation for being a great soldier and a very good commander, but also a bit abrasive and difficult to deal with. His hubris, ego, and lack of emotional regulation bothered many that he fought with, and at the same time also inspired many others. Washington, who had a very good relationship with Arnold, assigned him to Rhode Island, where he was passed over for a promotion to Major General. Arnold, in typical fashion, felt so slighted that he asked to resign, a request that Washington refused to grant. After some successful militia engagements in Connecticut, Arnold got his promotion to Major General, finally. But upon finding out that he still wouldn't outrank the guy before him, he decided to, yep, you guessed it, resign again. Washington again told him no, and that he needed him to head north to New York to prepare for the defense of a colony, with Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne having recently taken back Fort Ticonderoga. Arnold then participated in the famous Battle of Saratoga, getting into a shouting match with Horatio Gates, disobeying his orders, and once again injuring that same left leg. He had to sit out for a few months, choosing to keep his leg instead of amputating it, leaving him crippled with his left leg 2 inches shorter than his right, and at this point Benedict Arnold physically will never be the same. He will always be handicapped, use a cane, walk with a severe limp, and over time his leg will become more and more a nuisance for him. Eventually, one of the reasons that caused him to eventually die was the infection and the gout and everything going on in his leg from these injuries. After returning to the Continental Army, surprising many of the soldiers when he arrived in May of 1778 at Valley Forge, Washington appointed Arnold as military governor of Philadelphia after Clinton withdrew to New York. This was a critical mistake because while Arnold was quite the soldier and an incredibly brave and fearless leader on the battlefield, he did not have the skills to govern this critically divided city, nor the patience or tact to be a successful politician. In Philadelphia, Arnold became embroiled in some questionable business dealings, leading many to begin to distrust his intent. Arnold was court-martialed because of these actions and felt publicly shamed when Washington himself gave him a light reprimand, something Washington did not see as much of a big deal. And we'll talk about this a little bit more detail in a few minutes. While dabbling in corruption, Arnold apparently exploited government wagons to move private goods. He likely felt a lot of the pressure to be able to make money to mingle with those of importance in Philadelphia. Arnold was enjoying the high society that Philadelphia had to offer, and while doing that, met a woman named Peggy Shippen, the daughter of a well-known Loyalist sympathizer. Now, at this point in Arnold's life, he had a son and an ex-wife, but was currently available. I wanted to make sure I included that because we didn't talk about that in his earlier years. So, it seemed like a good match. What Arnold may or may not have known was that Peggy was also courted by a British gentleman officer in the past named John Andre. Andre was an incredibly likable guy, and Andre and Peggy had remained in touch, even though she had decided to cast her lot in marriage with Arnold. Peggy married Arnold in April of 1779. Now, what were the real reasons Arnold switched sides? And the reason I ask this is because this is where we're really going to dive into his deception. No one knows for sure. No one will ever be able to say with 100% certainty why he decided to betray his country. But as we've discussed, he had a difficult childhood, was petty, jealous, competitive, and both distrusted and disliked by many senior military officials. He had suffered multiple leg injuries and had been passed over for promotion one too many times, and to top it all off, he married a young, beautiful Tory bride. No matter the reason, examining the story itself has always been a fascinating exercise to me, and I look forward to diving deeper into it right now. By this point in his career, Arnold had accumulated significant debt to London financiers, and he was showing signs of his discontent. In November of 1778, Nathaniel Greene noted that he was, quote, told that General Arnold is become very unpopular among you, owing to his associating too much with the Tories. A few days later, Greene received a letter from Arnold in which he was lamenting the sad state of affairs in the colonies and clearly unhappy with its direction. Throughout this time, it is impossible to know how much of a role Peggy Shippen played in Arnold's change of heart, but it would seem unwise to dismiss her as anything less than a considerable influence. In May of 1779, Arnold began to put his plan for treason into motion, meeting with a man named Joseph Stansbury, and he instructed this man to offer his services to Sir Henry Clinton. Stansbury was eventually introduced to the new British spy chief instead, John Andre, the same man who had grown quite close to Arnold's new bride, Peggy. This was the beginning of a correspondence between Arnold and Andre, with Peggy at times acting as the intermediary. At this point, Andre informed Arnold that they would communicate primarily with Peggy and Stansbury as intermediaries while they negotiated exactly what Arnold would be able to offer them and how much it would cost. Initially, Arnold provided Andre with some troop movements, trying to prove his worth and negotiate the £10,000 that he desired. It was around this time that Arnold stood trial for his court-martial for those miscellaneous corrupt actions he had participated in while commanding in Philadelphia. He was able to avoid the most serious charges and only being found guilty for 2 minor offenses. But Washington publicly rebuked him anyway, publishing the following, quote, "The commander-in-chief would have been much happier in an occasion of bestowing commendations on an officer who had rendered such distinguished services to his country as Major General Arnold. But in the present case, a sense of duty and a regard to candor oblige him to declare that he considers his conduct in these convicted actions as imprudent and improper." Now, 21st century, that doesn't really sound all that bad. But in the 18th century, that stung. Arnold was beyond furious after Washington published this. After all he had done for his country, this is how he was repaid, by being publicly humiliated by a man whom he emulated? Embarrassed by this rebuke and annoyed at the subsequent congressional inquiry into his behavior, Arnold resigned his post in Philly, because, of course he did, in April of 1780. And this is almost 1 year into his exploration for treason, so keep in mind, he's been talking through back channels for almost a year at this point. But Arnold was still trying to make sense of his situation. In his time in the army, he had witnessed innumerable amounts of corruption and profiteering by other men, an army that was starving, a Congress that was, in his mind, incompetent, and commanders who were promoted without deserving it. And here he was, being scapegoated for misusing a few wagons? Big frickin' deal. And all of this was happening while the Americans were formally engaging in an alliance with the French. Seriously, the French? Arnold couldn't believe the Congress had turned down the Carlisle Commission, which literally gave the colonists everything that they had demanded back in 1775. And they turned it down anyway. He felt like he may end up on the wrong side of history if things kept moving in this direction. That same month, Arnold had been approached by Philip Schuyler about the possibility of taking command at West Point. With this in mind, Arnold made sure to stop by on a visit home in June and check it out. Further trying to prove his value to Sir Henry Clinton, Arnold then sent a very detailed report of the fort to the British. Arnold then made plans to sell his home and began to transfer his assets to London, confidently telling Clinton that his appointment to West Point was almost assured, and that he might even be able to provide, quote, a drawing of the works by which you might take without loss. Arnold, growing weary with what he perceived as a lack of response from the British, demanded that they be more responsive to him, and he upped his demand from £10,000 to £20,000. While Washington planned on giving Arnold some type of, real command of an army, Arnold said, no, just give me West Point. And Washington obliged. In August of 1780, Arnold obtained his command at West Point, and just a couple weeks later, he was, in fact, offered the £20,000 he desired, and on August 25th, his wife Peggy delivered to Arnold that Clinton had officially agreed to the terms. Clinton was excited. He thought that the defection from Arnold would be the first of many other dominoes to fall. Once men in the American army saw Arnold successfully defect and get paid in the process, he was sure others would follow suit. When on the verge of securing Arnold, Clinton predicted that, quote, the rebellion would end suddenly, in a crash. Once establishing himself at West Point, Arnold began to systematically and strategically weaken the defenses of the fort for the impending British siege that he was helping to coordinate. He dispersed of supplies so brazenly that there were grumblings that he may be selling the goods on the black market. After finalizing preparations for the deception, Arnold met John Andre on September 21st at the house of one of Arnold's old friends named Joshua Het Smith. Andre came over from New York City on the HMS Vulture, and one of Smith's rowboats met him and brought him to shore. Unfortunately for Andre, while he and Arnold were plotting the abdication of West Point, the Vulture was fired upon and had to move downriver, leaving Andre stranded at Smith's residence. Not a good place to be. On the other side of enemy lines, incognito, with specific plans detailing a major general's treason. Needing to get back to New York City, and Arnold wanting to get the hell out of there, they didn't know what to do. But having no way back, Andre became both worried and desperate. And like I said, Arnold wanted to get out of there. So he signed a pass, sort of like a get-out-of-jail-free card, that gave Andre permission to get back to New York City. But things did not work out as smoothly as they had hoped. Andre was approached by 3 militiamen near Tarrytown, New York, and they found the papers in Andre's boot that exposed the plot to capture West Point. I mean, what an amateur move. Seriously, dude? The papers are in your boot? The men sent the news to the unsuspecting Colonel John Jameson of the American forces. Andre, though, was sly enough to convince Jameson to send him to Arnold at West Point, knowing, of course, that he would be safe in the hands of Arnold, and that is what Jameson planned on doing. I mean, it's crazy. Andre is caught. He has details of, it's coded and everything, but it's clearly details of a treasonous plot. He has the plans for West Point. He's incognito. These guys catch him, and then he convinces the American colonel to actually send him to Benedict Arnold, the man who he is recruiting to switch sides. But things didn't work out as well for Andre as it sounds, because on his way back to Arnold, I mean, how sweet would that have been if he had been able to pull that one off? Benjamin Talmadge, one of the founding members of the Culper's firing, thought something definitely didn't feel right. It just, he was far more suspicious of Andre and Arnold than others. And he personally tracked down Andre and brought him back to camp to question him further. Meanwhile, to make things particularly crazy, on the morning of the 24th, Washington was planning on having breakfast with his old buddy, Benedict Arnold. While Washington was on his way to visit with Arnold, Arnold received Jameson's message, informing him that they had captured a British spy, John Andre, and that they had uncovered plans to commandeer West Point. Arnold began to freak out a bit, I'm sure. He hustled out of his house and had some men row him to the HMS Vulture, the ship that Andre was supposed to have taken back. Arnold took the Vulture to safe harbors in New York and wrote Washington a letter pleading with him, please do not punish Peggy for his defiance. When Washington arrived at Arnold's house, Arnold was nowhere to be found, but it was said that he had to step out and check something out at the fort. And then Washington went to the fort, and Arnold was once again nowhere to be found. Returning back to Arnold's house, Washington was shocked when he received news of what Arnold had done. Quote, Arnold has betrayed us. Who can we trust now? But to his credit, Washington remained pretty calm about the entire thing, considering. When the men went upstairs to check on Peggy, she put on an acting job that would have won an Oscar. She pretended to have gone mad, ranting and raving like a crazy person, allaying any suspicions that she could have possibly been involved in this plot. She was declared, in the moment, totally innocent, and was sent to a family's home in Philadelphia, where she later bragged about her performance and made fun of the American officers for their obliviousness and the fact that they were gullible enough to believe her. Nathaniel Greene, after hearing of Arnold's deception, said, quote, how black, how despised, loved by none and hated by all, once his country's idol, now her horror. When trying to determine what to do with Andre, Washington offered him in a trade for Arnold, a trade that Clinton summarily rejected. Andre, after a military tribunal, was eventually sentenced to hanging for his actions on October 2nd. And this was not an easy decision because by all accounts, Andre was a very well-respected man and like a really good guy. He was so respectful, in fact, that he wanted to put on his own blindfold and put the noose around his own neck, which he was allowed to do. And he died on October 2nd, hoping that people would report back that he died like a gentleman officer. The news of Andre's hanging infuriated many British. A British sergeant reported that, quote, no language can describe the mingled sensations of horror, grief, sympathy, and revenge that agitated the whole garrison. King George III knighted Andre's brother and even gave his mother a pension for what had been done to him. Alan Taylor, in American Revolutions, points out that the subsequent trashing of Arnold and exaltations of Andre made the distinctions between the Americans and the British seem even more stark. Washington later actually sent men into New York to try to capture Arnold, but he was able to narrowly escape their grasp and safely secure himself in the British ranks for the rest of the war. The next month, October of 1780, Arnold wrote an open letter to his fellow colonists titled, quote, The Inhabitants of America, justifying his actions by trashing the corruption, lies, and tyranny of the Second Continental Congress. Arnold went on to claim that he supported the war for independence initially, but once British had offered favorable terms, there was no need to continue to fight. He also mentioned that the alliance with France was more or less a final straw for him, and that this alliance was with a Catholic France, which was, quote, the enemy of the Protestant faith. As you can imagine, this letter and the ones that followed did not go over so well in the colonies. Arnold was given a brigadier general's commission in the army, but he did not get the 20,000 pounds he would have gotten if his plot didn't fail. But he did get 6,000 pounds, which was still a lot of money. He led British men in numerous battles and later abdicated his control of his men to Cornwallis when he met him in Virginia. Arnold kept pleading with Cornwallis, though, to allow him to attack strategic economic locations, and eventually Cornwallis allowed it. Arnold fought a few small battles in New England, close to his birthplace in Norwich, Connecticut, refusing to give colonial troops the honor of surrender and even burning down the town of New London, Connecticut, and these actions took place right down the river from his hometown. After the surrender of Cornwallis's army, Arnold was shipped back to London, where he did not receive the hero's welcome he had hoped. All of his attempts to re-engage the Americans failed, as did his attempts to get involved in the military again in really any impactful way. Arnold, resigning to peacetime duties, had become a man without a country, and one critic in London stating that he was, quote, a mean mercenary who, having adopted a cause for the sake of plunder, quits it when convicted of that charge. It also didn't help that he was constantly compared to Andre, who again, by all accounts, was an awesome dude and a true British hero and patriot. From 1785 to 1791, Arnold and his family lived and did business in St. John, New Brunswick, which is in southeastern Canada. And for that time, Arnold continued to piss people off, cheat them out of money, and just basically be the bastard that he always was. It got so bad that the townspeople of St. John actually burned him in effigy in his own front lawn. Damn, that is some serious hatred. After returning to London, Arnold got involved in business interests in the West Indies during the French Revolution. These actions almost got him captured and killed, but instead he earned both praise and 15,000 acres of land in present-day Ontario. In January 1801, at the age of 60, Arnold's health began a serious decline. On his deathbed that June, it is reported that he said, "Let me die in this old uniform in which I fought my battles. May God forgive me for ever having put on another." Now, who knows if he actually said this or not, and he probably didn't, but it certainly helped soften the blow of the last 20-plus years of just being the absolute worst. In the end, Arnold was seen as the most infamous traitor in U.S. history and one of the most infamous traitors in all of modern world history. Ben Franklin wrote that, quote, Judas sold only one man. Arnold, 3 million. Ouch. Someone inscribed traitor in his birth record in Norwich, and his family's tombstones were destroyed. Over time, his reputation has been dragged through the mud and exaggerated to pretty epic proportions. There are 2 monuments to Arnold, or, well, at least to his actions, and neither give him the courtesy of mentioning his name. At Saratoga, there is a, quote, boot monument that states, quote, in memory of the most brilliant soldier of the Continental Army, who was desperately wounded on this spot, winning for his countrymen the decisive battle of the American Revolution, and for himself, the rank of Major General. In addition, it just so happens that West Point has plaques commemorating all those who commanded the fort during the Revolution, but Arnold's plaque, well, it just says, Major General, born in 1740. Pretty brutal stuff. And that's the story of Benedict Arnold. His life, his decision to become the most infamous traitor in American history, and what happened to him afterwards. I hope you enjoyed it, And thanks for listening. And hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.